The Ferrar Papers are one of my favorite documents to look at to get information about the people who were here in the early 17th century in Virginia. In particular, the Ferrar Papers help us understand a little bit more about the women who came here to Jamestown in the early 1620s. And these women brought with them a variety of skills because the Virginia Company was specifically looking to recruit women who could be useful wives for the colonists, mostly male colonists who were here at the time. There was a huge gender imbalance at the beginning of the 17th century here at Jamestown, and so the Virginia Company was looking for a way to A, raise money to fund the women's journey, and B, to get something, get women here in the colonies so that the colonists could have a more stable sort of environment here. They thought that if they could get the men to marry and create households, it would get them tied to the land, tied here to their families, and just create a better environment for the colonists. So they were looking to recruit women with a lot to recommend them. That meant having literally letters of recommendation from gentlemen or people in the community with standing, and also kind of sharing the skills that these women had to show that, they had something to offer in Jamestown. So there were 57 women that are written about in the Ferrar Papers who came here in 1621. Now, why would these women want to come all the way across the ocean to Jamestown? Most of these women, it was a pretty difficult marriage market in the early 17th century in England. There weren't many eligible men for these women to marry, and it was crucial for women to get married in the period. You went from being under your father's household and then hopefully into a husband's household. So they wanted to fulfill what society expected from them and find a husband. And so they were willing to go all the way over to Virginia to find that husband. My favorite part about what we can learn about the skills of these women from the Ferrar Papers are the textile skills that they brought with them. And their skills are written down, again, so that we can see the sorts of things they could offer. And it's interesting that a lot of these textile skills probably weren't skills that they were going to use in Virginia, because they tend to be more decorative, more luxury items, but it does show just how skilled and how dedicated these women could be to a craft. Now, one skill that 3 of these women had, and those women were Susan Binks, Audrey Hoare, and Ann Tanner, they all knew how to do blackwork. And blackwork was a very, very popular form of embroidery throughout the entire 16th century and into the 17th century. So this had been in fashion for a very long time. Blackwork, as the name might suggest, is a form of monochromatic embroidery. So it's embroidery done with one color, usually black, but it could also be done in red or blue, but most often you see black. And it was that single color worked in designs on white linen fabric. Now, this could be done on things such as shirts, which are men's basic undergarment, or smocks, which are the female equivalent for women. Other body linens, such as women's coifs, head coverings, things like ruffs, basically any linen accessory or garment you can think of, as well as household linens like sheets or pillowcases. So those are the types of things that you would find blackwork embroidery on. And in our collection, as part of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, we have a number of original 17th century coifs and forehead cloths, which accompany the coifs, that have blackwork embroidery on them. And you can even still see the base pattern that was drawn or stenciled on to the linen before the black silk embroidery was done on them. Now, Susan Binks, who could do black work, was also noted as being able to do white work, which again, as the name suggests, is all white embroidery done on white linen fabric. And this would have been done in white linen thread on white linen fabric, so giving a different look. And whitework continues to be a popular form of decoration throughout the following centuries, well into the 20th century. And this would have been done on items similar to blackwork, so things like coifs and shirts and smocks and aprons. Now, Anne Harmer, she could do a type of embroidery called gold work, and this was probably the most exclusive type of embroidery that you would find in this period because, yeah, it's done with actual gold or actual silver. And you would do this either with the metals wrapped around a silk thread that you would use to stitch, or it would be really, really thin strips of the metal that you would lay on the fabric and then sew that down with another silk thread. And again, because you're using those precious metals, it is a very, expensive, luxurious type of embellishment. And for all of these women with these types of embellishment, embroidery, it's not necessarily that they're doing that kind of embroidery for themselves or for their families. They were probably learning these skills and doing it for sale so that they could make money to support themselves and their families. Probably not actually making it to wear themselves. Now, Audrey Hoare, that I mentioned being able to do black work earlier, she is noted as being proficient in plain work. And that means all of the utilitarian making and mending of linen garments, like the shirts and the smocks, aprons, falling bands, and ruffs, and all of the household linen items like sheets and towels. So as the name suggests, plain work because it is plain utilitarian sewing. However, that is going to be really, really important at Jamestown because maintaining and creating those undergarments, those utilitarian pieces and the household linens, that's important just for daily life and daily survival. We also know about other women who lived at Jamestown who did this kind of work, who came over earlier, who were making shirts for the colony, and that is also a type of what they would consider plain work. So more useful perhaps than the black work, white work, and gold work, although not as fancy. Now, Mary Gibbs was known for being able to make bone lace. And no, the lace isn't made out of bones, but it's made using bobbins, so sort of like little sticks that were originally made out of bone and ivory. And the linen threads, or metal threads, because you could have both bone lace made out of linen or out of metal, those threads would be wrapped onto the bobbins, anchored at a point usually using a cushion, and then the bobbins are essentially braided or passed over each other and on this network of pins so that you could create the design of the lace. And this could be, again, linen or silk or metal, very decorative. And bobbin lace, as it comes to be known, they don't usually call it bone lace after that, continues to be practiced even today. Now, Audrey Hoare, who I mentioned, she has a lot of skills. She was also noted as being able to make all manner of buttons. And when they're talking about making buttons, it doesn't mean, just wooden buttons or metal buttons. They're specifically talking about Audrey being able to make thread-covered buttons. And you would start with a wood core, and then you would wrap threads over that wooden core to decorate them. And this could be very simple, using maybe linen thread, or it could be very complex designs with silk, multiple different colors that are wrapped over in very complex designs. And when you think about the number of buttons being used, a man's doublet could have, 30 buttons just down the front of it. There were lots of buttons being used. And it might seem like thread-covered buttons would only be used by the very upper class, but when you think about this is a skill that could be easily taught to children who could do sort of cottage industry, making up hundreds of buttons in their spare time. And we know also from the Ferrar Papers that the Virginia Company purchased dozens and dozens of thread buttons to be brought over to Jamestown to be used by the colonists. And the fact that they specifically call them thread buttons indicates that they may have been made out of linen thread, because thread in the time period, the word itself is synonymous with linen. So if you ever hear the mention of thread stockings, that actually means they're linen stockings. Now, Martha Baker is noted as being skillful in the weaving and making of silk points. Well, what are points? In the 17th century, a lot of garments needed to be tied or laced up, like the bodices of women's kirtles and petticoats, Or men, their doublets, the fitted jackets, and the breeches were often pointed or tied together to keep everything in place. And so they needed points to be able to do that. Now, the points are ribbons or cords or braids that are woven specifically for the purpose, and the ends of them are finished with a little metal tube called an aglet. And you actually still have aglets on your shoelaces, but now they're made out of plastic. But it's called an aglet the same way it was in the 17th century. So those points are very, very useful for just about everything that needs tying together on clothing in the 17th century. And having a dozen points is something that John Smith recommends in his 1624 list for people who are thinking about coming to Virginia. So Martha Baker would have been skillful in weaving those silk points, weaving the cords or the braids for that. Now that comes from a long tradition of a guild or a trade that was primarily done by women throughout the medieval period and into the 17th century. And that's the trade of the silk woman. And silk women would import raw silk threads, and they would weave them up into cords and braids that could be used for points or even decorative braids and cords on garments as well. But it's interesting to note that in a time where we usually think about men being in trades, women were just as involved in trades, and some of those trades were predominantly practiced by women, such as the silk women's trade. Now, Anne Tanner was noted as being able to spin, and that is the process of turning raw fibers such as wool or flax into yarn or thread. And in the early 17th century, they have a spinning wheel, multiple sizes of spinning wheels that they can use to spin wool or flax into thread, or they're also still using a spindle and a distaff. Now that means they're holding the distaff, which is like a big stick, and the raw fiber is at the end of the distaff, kind of loosely tied on there. Then they'll pull a little bit of raw fiber from the distaff, and it attaches to their spindle, which they're holding in their other hand. You put a spin on the spindle, and it begins to spin that raw thread that's coming off of your distaff. That's a more portable way to spin. You could go out, check on the chickens, check on the garden while holding your distaff and your spindle, and walking around and doing that instead of being tied to an actual spinning wheel for a long time. And spinning probably would have been fairly useful at Jamestown if you need thread or if you need yarn, but likely this wouldn't have ended up being turned into fabric because at this point, early in the 17th century, we don't have the infrastructure here at Jamestown to be weaving fabric. That is a completely different trade. There is a lot involved in that between looms and all of the finishing processes involved in fabric. So it would have been much, much cheaper for the colonists to just import fabric from England in the way that we find it a lot cheaper today to import things that are made in other countries as opposed to them being made in our own country. Now, with some of that yarn, perhaps that Anne Tanner is spinning, Susan Binks could knit that yarn because she was noted as being skilled in knitting. And in the 17th century, they're knitting in wool, in silk, and in linen, like I mentioned earlier with those thread stockings. You could have knitted linen stockings, which would be nice and cool in the summer, especially here in Virginia. But they're also knitting items like caps or garters to hold up your stockings, small purses, and also men's waistcoats, which are not quite like a vest like you think of in the 18th century or today. It's more of an undergarment that was worn over a man's shirt, under his doublet or his cassock, so that he could have an extra layer of warmth. And those could be wool or silk. And those could be either simple or very elaborately knitted. So that's an example of the textile skills, some more practical than others, but all showing that the women had been dedicated to these crafts and that they could offer something to their husbands and the fellow colonists here in Jamestown. But we also know that these women had other skills such as brewing or dairying, so making butter and cheese, and what they would consider housewifery skills. Brewing and dairying and baking were very much considered women's work, if you will, things that were expected of a very competent housewife or farm wife to be able to do. And these women, they were coming here trying to show that they could make it and that they should have a good husband who had lots of land to grow lots of tobacco and hopefully have a better life in Virginia than they might have had back in England. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below, especially if you have any questions that we can answer. And don't forget to follow our channel so that you can catch us in the next video. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.